Stop what you're doing. Close the door. Turn off the lights. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't a story about a movie. It's a story about you. About the exact moment you lock a motel room door, turn on the shower, and for just one split second, feel completely, utterly alone. In 1960, a 60-year-old British director pointed a camera at a shower curtain and broke something inside the American psyche that has never fully healed. His name was Alfred Hitchcock. The film was Psycho, and if you are anywhere near 40 years old, you already know the feeling I'm talking about. That particular chill, the one that has followed you into every roadside motel, every empty rest stop bathroom, every house you've stayed in alone. Psycho didn't just scare you, it rewired you. But here is what Hitchcock never told you. Here is what the studio never wanted you to ask. Norman Bates, the soft-spoken, taxidermy-loving, mother-obsessed man behind the Bates Motel, was not invented from nothing. He was not a fever dream. He was not a metaphor. He was a photograph of a real man, a man who lived in a small town in Wisconsin called Plainfield. A man who did things so far beyond the frame of any film, so grotesque, so intimate, so human, that even the most daring screenwriters in Hollywood history chose to look away. This is the story they didn't put on screen. His name was Edward Theodore Gein. Born in 1906, died in 1984. Buried in Plainfield Cemetery, which, for decades, locals had to guard against vandals who wanted to destroy his headstone. Not out of hate, out of something darker: fascination. Ed Gein was quiet. Neighbors described him as odd but harmless. He babysat local children. He did odd jobs. He smiled when you waved at him from across the street. And at night, he went home to a farmhouse that the police would later describe, and I want you to hold on to this phrase, as a human museum. But before we get to the farmhouse, we need to understand something about Ed Gein that the movies never fully captured. We need to understand his mother, Augusta Gein, a deeply religious woman, severe, domineering, and completely convinced that the outside world was infected with sin. She raised her two sons, Henry and Ed, on an isolated 195-acre farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. No friends, no social contact, just the farm, the Bible, and Augusta's unrelenting voice. She told Ed that women, all women except her, were instruments of the devil. She read him violent Old Testament passages about death, murder, and divine punishment. She made him believe that the only pure relationship a man could ever have was with his mother. And Ed believed her. He believed her so completely that when Augusta died of a series of strokes in December 1945, something in Ed Gein's mind didn't just break, it inverted. After his mother's death, Ed nailed shut the doors to Augusta's bedroom and her sitting room. He left them exactly as they were: her furniture, her Bible, her reading glasses still on the table, a shrine. The rest of the house he let decay, garbage accumulated for years. The smell was indescribable to the few people who had ever been inside. dishes never washed, floors never swept. But Ed Gein himself, thin, pale, always slightly smiling, went about his business in Plainfield, paid his taxes, collected his mail. And then, slowly, something in him began to hunger for more than memory. He started reading medical textbooks, anatomy guides, true crime pulp magazines about Nazi experiments, particularly the ones involving human remains. He became obsessed with the idea of the physical body as a material, as something that could be shaped. In 1947, Ed Gein walked into a cemetery for the first time. He didn't leave empty-handed.
On the evening of November 16, 1957, a hardware store owner in Plainfield named Bernice Warden went missing. Her son, Frank Warden, was the local deputy. He came back to the store after his shift and found it empty. The cash register was open. There was a pool of blood on the floor. The last entry in the store's receipt book was a sale to Ed Gein for a half-gallon of antifreeze. Deputies drove out to the Gein farm. They knocked, no answer. They pushed open the door, and then they stopped moving. I want to describe what they found carefully, not for shock, not for spectacle, but because what Ed Gein had built inside that farmhouse is the direct key to understanding why Psycho still haunts us 65 years later, why Norman Bates feels so real even to people who have never seen the film. The farmhouse had been divided, in Ed's mind, into two spaces. The rooms he kept nailed shut, Augusta's rooms, remained pristine, untouched, sacred. The rooms he lived in had become something else entirely. Investigators found 10 skulls, several of which had been modified, some mounted, some turned into bowls. They found a vest constructed from a female torso, complete, with the skin still attached, tanned like leather. They found 9 preserved faces, some of which had been stuffed and mounted like hunting trophies. They found chairs upholstered in human skin. They found a paper bag containing 9 preserved female noses. And in the summer kitchen, in the dark, past the threshold of the back door, they found Bernice Warden, suspended from the ceiling beams, dressed out like a deer. The lead investigator, Captain Lloyd Schofuster, later said, and these are his exact words, "It looked like something straight out of a weird movie." Except no movie had ever shown this, because no one had ever imagined this. Ed Gein confessed to grave robbing at least 40 graves over a period of roughly 10 years, visiting local cemeteries on nights when he felt what he described as a daze coming over him. He selected women who resembled his mother. He was not, in his own reckoning, a killer first. He was an architect. He was trying to build Augusta back, piece by piece, grave by grave, body by body. He wanted to wear her. He wanted to become her. When Robert Bloch wrote his 1959 novel Psycho, inspired directly by the Ed Gein case, he made one crucial creative choice. He made Norman Bates handsome, charming, the kind of man you'd feel sorry for. Hitchcock doubled down on that choice, because here is the truth that Psycho understood before any other horror film. The monster doesn't come at you with claws and fangs. The monster offers you a sandwich and says, "I think we're all in our private traps." The monster feels familiar, and that is the single most terrifying sentence in the history of American horror.
Let me ask you something personal. You're 40 years old, give or take a few years.
which means you grew up in a time before every motel room had a double bolt and a security chain that you actually trusted. Before you developed the habit, maybe without even realizing it, of checking behind the shower curtain. Where did that habit come from? It came from Psycho. The shower scene is 45 seconds long. It contains 78 cuts. Janet Leigh, Marion Crane, never shows full nudity. The knife never visibly penetrates the skin. But your nervous system doesn't know that, because Hitchcock wasn't filming a murder. He was filming the violation of safety. He chose a shower for the same reason Ed Gein chose the privacy of a farmhouse on an empty road, because both of them understood something primal. The most terror comes not from what hunts you in the dark, but what finds you when you think you are safe. In 1960, a shower was an act of profound, vulnerable trust. You were alone, you were unclothed, the water was loud, your eyes were closed. Hitchcock put a camera in that moment and said, "What if trust was always the mistake?" For 74% of you watching this, Americans, most of you in your 40s, many of you who have driven those long Midwestern interstates, this isn't abstract. You've been on those roads. You've pulled into a parking lot at 11 p.m. because the tank was almost empty and the next town was 30 miles away. You've stood at a front desk while someone handed you a key, and some part of your brain, the part that watched Psycho at 16 and never quite recovered, did the math. That math is called situational awareness, but it started as fear. It started with Hitchcock in a pair of scissors and a woman in a shower who had no idea what was about to come through the curtain. Here is what Psycho did to American culture that we almost never talk about. It was the first major Hollywood film to suggest that the threat was already inside the building, not outside, not in the wilderness, not in the foreign or the other. Inside, in the next room, wearing a smile. Before Psycho, Hollywood monsters were external. They came from space, from the ocean, from foreign countries. They were other. After Psycho, the monster checked you in, asked you how your drive was, and told you that room 1 was the closest to the office. This changed everything. Silence of the Lambs, American Psycho, No Country for Old Men, Zodiac. Every single one of these films exists because Hitchcock taught us that the most dangerous predators in human history do not look dangerous, and Ed Gein proved him right.
Ed Gein was found legally insane in 1957 and committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. He was tried in 1968, found guilty of first-degree murder, and immediately returned to psychiatric custody, where he would remain until his death from respiratory failure in 1984. He was 77 years old. He never showed remorse exactly, but he also never showed pleasure. When asked about his crimes, he often replied in the detached clinical tone of someone describing a hobby they had since given up. He is the blueprint, not just for Norman Bates, but for Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, for the entire genre of the American serial killer as psychological portrait, as cultural mirror, as warning. Because that is what Ed Gein ultimately was, not a monster from another world, a warning. The house is gone. The graves he desecrated have been reconsecrated. The police photographs are sealed in archives. Plainfield, Wisconsin, population 900, has spent 60 years trying to forget. But Psycho made sure we never would. And I genuinely think,
that's not entirely a bad thing. Because here is the truth that both Alfred Hitchcock and Ed Gein force us to confront. Evil does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive with red eyes and a knife raised overhead. It doesn't come howling out of the darkness. It drives a used truck to the hardware store on a Tuesday morning. It smiles at your children. It asks if you need help carrying your bags. And then it goes home, to a house full of locked doors and old photographs, to a world that exists entirely inside its own head. A world where the dead never left, where the rules of ordinary life dissolved long ago, and where the only thing that remains is hunger. The kind of hunger that no grave, no farmhouse, no locked motel room door can satisfy.
The next time you check into a motel room, the next time you slide the bolt and turn on the shower, ask yourself one question. Did you check what was behind the curtain? Because Norman Bates always left the light on. Ed Gein always said hello, and neither of them looked like what they were. If this story got under your skin, if you want to understand how real darkness becomes cultural mythology, subscribe, because next week we're going somewhere even darker. We're going to the town where they thought the killings had finally stopped. They were wrong.